Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more of Warhammer 40k lore, where today we are going to have a look at Imperial Knights. Now, the Knights have a rather interesting bit of non-fluff backstory, as they were introduced in 2014, where they completely upended the entire meta at the time, practically breaking the game there for a few months, as back then vehicles, of course, had armor values and facing rules and all sorts of interesting stuff that has since been stripped out of modern-day 40k. The introduction of knights and an entire army of knights, well, it meant that the usual quantity of anti-tank weaponry was nowhere even remotely close to sufficient to dealing with them. They also arrived mere months before the official introduction of 7th edition, where the vehicle rules changed yet again, and which was followed by another Imperial Knight Army book about a year or so later. So, the Knights launched, broke the game, and were then largely invalidated by the new codex for about a year. One wonders why GW couldn't simply have waited a few months to release the Imperial Knights Codex alongside 7th edition, but GW does what GW does. And in the case of the Knights, the most likely explanation for their somewhat haphazard introduction is because GW had learned not that long ago that they, with the Apocalypse rule set, could create very, very large models, like Warhound Titans, and sell them for very, very large amounts of money. But this being the modern-day incarnation of the Knights is not actually the first version of the Knights, since they actually stem all the way back to before 40k was even 40k, having been introduced as a supplementary set of rules in 1990 in an issue of White Dwarf, Games Workshop's hobby magazine. And there wasn't just Imperial Knights. The Eldar got some too, although they more or less swiftly disappeared and were instead replaced with pseudo-light Titan-style things, as the public debut, shall we say, of the Knights actually occurred a little bit later on again in Titan Legions. I really like the epic style of games, like Warmaster too, but the rule sets were never very good. I liked the idea behind them, and I liked the theory of large-scale formations, but they never quite clicked with the majority. But anywho, enough with the history lesson, it's time to get into some of the actual fluff. So, the Knights. I consider they, in their modern incarnation, to be just about precisely on the dividing line between old 40k and current 40k. And I do have several misgivings about the fluff that I'll bore you with at the end of the video. So let's get started, shall we, with what the Knights are today. So, the Knights themselves were originally intended to be multi-purpose utilitarian work platforms, rather than the war machines they are almost exclusively, in fact I do believe actually exclusively, used as today. The example of this given by the Knight's de facto creator was, for example, the enormous chainsword weapon. This was originally intended to be for clearing local fauna or cutting down timber. Presumably, the Knight would also have a variety of other attachment, like ploughing attachment or earth-moving attachment or manipulator gripping arms, for uses in construction perhaps, or even hooks and cranes and all manners of such things, allowing one person to do a job that would otherwise require specialized heavy construction machinery. Of course, in modern 40k, using something like a knight for, well, farming would be absurd. But back during the golden age of technology, where the STC, the Standard Template Construct Pattern engines, were sent along with every single human colonist effort throughout the galaxy, something like the Knight would literally just have been a utility platform. something that could easily be created with a combination of local resources and those found in the colony ships themselves, as the vessels were intended to be deconstructed after they had safely delivered all of the colonists to provide them with access to all of the significantly more advanced technology required to kickstart the planet's own industrial economy. Often, the converted hulk of the colony ships would then become the primary base of operation for the knightly orders, eventually their fortress. But here's the interesting thing. If all you need to do is chop down trees, then surely, amongst the millions upon millions upon millions of templates found within the STC database, there has got to be something better for the job than a knight. So why would anyone ever select to get the knight instead of that hypothetical enormous wood-clearing engine? Well, the answer appears to lie in the fact that the overwhelming majority of knight worlds that exist in the modern 41st millennium, they have a history, or even a current population, of some sort of super predator or other danger that posed a significant risk to the initial colonist population, suggesting that the knights were chosen not as an ideal solution to whatever problem was at hand, but rather as, again, literally, a utility engine. Sure, the knight could be used to farm the fields or to clear out the forests, but due to its modularity, you could just as easily slap on an enormous cannon and have it go hunting literal dragons, as on one example planet, or huge flesh-eating predators that might pop in and devour huge portions of local villages. This idea might also, at least to a certain extent, explain the reason why the ritual of becoming, the process where a rider or a pilot is bonded to his knight, tends to produce a very specific sort of society, as the knight is controlled in much the same way as a titan, through a neural interface, surgically implanted into the pilot and then connected with the knight. The first connection is known as the ritual of becoming, and tends to be the same on every single knightly world. Now, we'll get back to this in a little moment because it's an interesting little factoid, but just like with a titan, a part of the pilot's psyche is imprinted upon the machine, and a certain fragment of the pilot will always reside within the machine, no matter how long it's been, and no matter how many pilots have occupied that particular machine, until the knight itself develops a sort of pseudo-personality. Some might even claim, and there are hard evidence to suggest that they are correct, that the spirits of deceased pilots still live on, at least to a certain degree, within the machine, and that their own wisdom, experiences, sensibilities, personalities, etc. can still be not only located, but maybe even brought to the fore during periods of extreme stress or danger for the machine. But there is clearly some sort of base-level personality within the knight. Because if all that was happening was that a succession of riders imprinted upon the machine, then the machine itself would surely be formed primarily by the local planet's culture. And yet it is not. Instead, the knights seem to form society around them rather than be formed by it, as practically all worlds that have knights are knight worlds, where you have often a very feudal system with a noble class controlling the knights. You have sacred sacristians taking care of the knights. You even have much the same terminology for their various rituals and maintenance procedures, even for their storage yards and facilities. This should not happen unless there is some sort of baseline programming found within the knight itself that again forms society and its riders, and there is a certain degree of sensibility to this. Now, the real reason is because GW thought to themselves, knights, well, that means feudal society, right? And so that is what they made. But I can circle this square peg, at least to a degree, because, okay, if we accept the supposition, which, bear you in mind, is not always true either, mind you, that the knights were primarily made on worlds with some sort of predominant threat, then the knights were clearly intended to not just be a utility engine, but also one of self-defense against certain fairly large-scale threats. Because if they were merely small-scale threats, well, you'd just produce, bolters or Lehman Russes, or actually not Lehman Russes, Baneblades, which in the STC template is considered a light scouting vehicle. So clearly there is some sort of specific threat that the knight is intended to counter. Okay, let's say that this threat is some sort of hyperactive predator. Some sort of super duper lion or a dragon or something along those lines, right? Well, these creatures are, like most natural creatures, likely to be picking their prey relatively carefully. It is a rare animal indeed that simply attacks entire, villages or even houses, etc. Because animals don't like being outnumbered, because being outnumbered means that your chance of getting injured increase drastically, and getting injured in the animal kingdom often leads to death. Most predators tend to be enormous cowards for this reason, preferring to kill things that they know for a fact they can kill with relative ease. Okay? So they would probably be predators of opportunity. They would be attacking isolated humans, lone humans, or small scouting parties, for example. Alright, well, how do you deal with this? You build villages. And then you place those villages within easy range of a rapid reaction force that can cross any terrain that the beast might decide to retreat into, e.g., a knight with a castle with surrounding feudal villagers bound to the lord of the castle through a feudal system where the farmers are, tilling the land, getting raw resources, etc., giving up a tithe to the lord in return for protection. That is a system that would make a certain degree of sense on a planet plagued by hyper-aggressive monsters with a taste for human flesh. Now, you could also equally easily argue that they might as well just download the STC pattern for a plascrete bunker complete with automated gun turrets and be done with it, but listen, I'm trying to find a more logical reason, okay? And hey, there are even situations in which even just building a bunker might not be good enough. If they're fighting some sort of really monstrous creature, as, well, it's one of the tropes of 40k, isn't it? That Space Marine armor is really, really amazing and super, super tough, except whenever they find themselves in combat with literally anything. As always, every single little Xenos Empire described somehow has developed the weaponry to easily defeat Space Marine armor. Hell, there are even the Tyranids, of course, who can make just claws, driven by simple good old-fashioned muscle and sinew that can tear apart Terminator armor. So, clearly, the 41st millennium requires a bit more than your average security measures. And the knights appear to have been good enough, as on most of the worlds where you found some sort of ridiculous uber predator, the knights have, more often than not, hunted them to complete extinction, unless they're keeping a few alive, mostly just for sports. Now you might then also wonder, okay, well, if it is an immediate security measure against whatever threat is located on the planet, then fair enough, but why do they then turn into night worlds, since long after whatever beastie has been bothering the local peasantry is long wiped off the face of the local earth, the nobles still exist. In fact, the feudal system still exists. Well, let me put it like this. The people that are piloting the knights are also the ones located on top of all of the ancient machinery located within the old colony ships. In fact, more often than not, they have built an actual literal castle on top of the old core. They are in possession of all of the technology, most if not all of the power generating assets, and they have knights. Good luck with your revolution is more or less what I'm saying. As the nobles have an absolute monopoly on force, and as it turns out, they like being in charge. Weird, I know. And that is in all due likelihood the reason why night worlds remain night worlds, even if there is no clear and present threat to them anymore. This could also in part be because of the rather aggressive nature of the Knights' spirits themselves. Again, the Knights seem designed more for combat in all due reality than their utilitarian role, and so they will also shape their pilots to be far more aggressive, more competitive might be the correct word. As it is also relatively rare for there to be more than one or two or maybe three knightly houses on a planet. Generally speaking, they will be divided across huge areas of the planet, which they will claim as their de facto territory. There are worlds with several knightly houses, but they're few and far between, probably because once they've wiped out the predators, they'll begin wiping out each other. Such enthusiasm needs an outlet, and usually the knightly houses will find some way to vent their anger on nearby Xenos empires in aid of Imperial expeditions, Astartes forces, or Adeptus Mechanicus expeditions. Now, this is where it gets a little bit weird again, because theoretically, apparently, the knightly worlds are not actually subjects of the Imperium. Which is nonsense, incidentally. Of course they're subjects of the Imperium. This isn't like the Adeptus Mechanicus, where there's a vast overarching organization that is the Imperium's ally. Even a single knightly world, sure, it might be powerful on an individual basis, but it's nothing compared to the Imperium. They're not sitting on some sort of irreplaceable archotech or access to the industrial might of the Mechanicus. Of course they'd be subjugated if the need arises, but presumably it's, again, the idea of the feudal lords, etc. In that, more often than not, the knights can be called upon through bonds of honor or oaths of fealty or requests for aid dependent upon long-standing relationships. So a knightly household will have some sort of relationship with a sector governor, for example, who can then entreat them with emissaries and gifts and other such nonsense to have them come to their aid. It's a bit of a derpy system and weird considering the power structure of the Imperium. It makes sense with the Adeptus Mechanicus because the Mechanicus has something that the knightly houses absolutely need and really cannot survive without: knowledge and technology. Now, obviously, the knightly houses will have had the technology to create and maintenance their knights at some point. This technology was then near universally transferred over to their own tech servants, who were responsible for the maintenance and well-being of the knights. But already during the Horus Heresy, this information, this know-how and tech understanding was beginning to wane, as a feudal system is hardly the most encouraging for technological growth and innovation, as one might say. Meaning that the Adeptus Mechanicus is a vital repository for further information, and to teach the knights and their tech servants anything that they might have forgotten over the long millennia, and as a source of spare parts. As when it comes to industry as well, knights' worlds tend to not be particularly over-furnished in that regard, often leaving them entirely reliant on nearby forge worlds. Indeed, many knightly houses and worlds consider themselves to be not a part of the Mechanicum, but definitely a very, very closely aligned cog. To the point where, if the Forge World or Adept in question requests aid, the knightly houses must answer, and not to do so would be nearly unimaginable, and if it were to happen only during the most extreme of circumstances, like the house itself being under direct threat of annihilation, and even then, it would be an enormous shame that the house would in all due likelihood never be allowed to forget, even if it managed to survive that cataclysmic loss of faith, as something tells me that their masters in the Mechanicum would not be quite so lenient, shall we say, towards the knightly houses' requests for aid, maintenance, and spare parts after having been stood up once. Though that might actually be the least of the consequences, because the knightly houses really do take their whole honor thing very, 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 very seriously. It is their identity, their reason for existence, and so they are very unlikely to ever not respond to a call for aid. Again, particularly from the Mechanicus, whom they feel a certain kinship with, particularly Titan legions, as many Titan legions have their own little pet houses of knights, which they call upon to act as, well, infantry. Damn near, for a Titan legion. A knight in a Titan fight is worth relatively little. A big enough pack of them might be able to mildly annoy a scout Titan here and there. Hell, they might even potentially be able to deal with larger Titans, should they be able to screw them over, catch them by surprise, ambush them, or simply overwhelm them with numbers, but they are, in essence, super heavy infantry for the Titan legions. But that too is of course very, very useful, as getting up close to a Titan, that is where it is most vulnerable. Because whilst most of the larger Titans have all sorts of bastion weaponry and point defense arms, indeed some of them even have entire garrisons within their legs, they are, nevertheless, a hell of a lot easier to take over from the inside out than they are to destroy from the outside and in. As for everybody else, gaining the aid of a knightly house is, well, again, it's a question of protocol. If you already have their allegiance, their oaths, their loyalty, for whatever reason, then all you need do is call upon it. If you don't, you might need to entreat their aid for a particular campaign or a particular goal, promising them rewards or fealty or favors, perhaps, in return. Or you might go about recruiting three-blade knights, sorta pseudo-kinda mercenaries, but not really, because mercenaries of course fight for money, and whilst that could be a potential motivation for a three-blade knight, more often than not, they are people who have disassociated themselves with their original houses to go out and do something, some sort of quest. Many just do so because they like action, pew pew. Others have a higher calling or a specific goal in mind, some have a vendetta. Indeed, there could even be entire houses with particular interests which could be relied upon to garner their aid in battle. They might have an enemy, for example, that they hate a lot, and would be willing to sign up to fight alongside Imperial Guard regiments so long as they get an opportunity to have a crack at aforementioned enemy. They might also fight alongside more prestigious forces, like the Adeptus Astartes, simply because, well, it's pretty damn cool to fight along Space Marines now, isn't it? It is also possible for those in sufficiently elevated positions of power to request the aid of the knightly houses as a form of payment of the Imperial tithe. As of course all planets are expected to pay their tithe in some way or another. Being mostly feudal worlds, often I imagine the knightly worlds would pay in foodstuff, grain, various exports of material resources, wood perhaps. And of course, fighting-age men is something the Imperium always need, and the Night Worlds are likely to have at least decently trained forces or PDF from which they can draw upon to create Imperial Guard regiments. But the true reward is obviously to get some sort of a commitment from the knightly houses themselves. Now this will very, very rarely be a permanent commitment along the lines of the Imperial Guard, detaching an entire house or a detachment of knights to the Guard, that is, because the knights themselves are unbelievably valuable, and making more of them is not particularly easy. Indeed, for many knightly worlds, it might be downright impossible, and so sending off a portion of their knights to wage wars across the Imperium for all eternity, well, that is a mighty big ask. But detaching formations for particular objectives or even campaigns, etc., that can absolutely happen. The Mechanicus does occasionally ask for entire grouping of knights to be forwarded to them, but this is usually seen as a tremendous honor, and the Mechanicus will no doubt be expected to provide adequate compensation to the house as well, and usually this is done when they are recruited de facto by Titan legions, and again, being allowed to fight alongside a Titan legion is a massive prize. Being permanently absorbed into the legion is an even greater, and perhaps the single greatest honor that any knight can ever aspire to, as it is a recognition of great and worthy service in the name of the Legion. As for the nature of that service, well, let's talk a little bit about the role of knights on the battlefield. So we are going to be talking mainly about the more traditional forms of knights here, the standard patterns, wardens, valiants, gallants, castellans, etc., rather than the bigger and fancier forms of the Cerastus knights. So, as mentioned, knights come in classes. These classes usually refer to a sort of weapon setup. The Knight Paladin, for example, is equipped with a rapid-fire battle cannon and a Reaper chainsword. The latter of the two gives the machine plentiful close-quarters combat, as getting hit by a meters-long chainsword is never a pleasant experience for pretty much anything at all. But its true forte is medium-ranged combat, as the rapid-fire battle cannon lives up to its name, as the knight is able to pump out a weight of fire equivalent to that of a small squadron of Leman Russ battle tanks. Most other knight patterns tend to be a bit more specialized than this, however, like the Knight Errant, which retains the Reaper chainsword or a Thunderstrike gauntlet, depending on, and a specialized close-range anti-tank weapon known as the Thermal Cannon, which is essentially an even bigger, more super version of the melter weapon used by so many other Imperial forces. And of course, the specialization can go yet further still, with machines like the Knight Gallant, which eschews any ranged weaponry beyond a heavy stubber here and there, in favor of two heavy close-quarters weapons, like a Reaper chainsword and a Thunderstrike gauntlet. This is a risky gamble, no doubt, as getting rid of all ranged weaponry in a universe where a target the size of a knight can probably be easily found and shot at several kilometers would normally mean a swift and inescapable death to anything that tries to do it, unless they have overwhelming numbers. But the knights, of course, are not protected merely by heavy armor. They also have the Ion Shield. This is a directional energy defense system that can create a very tough-to-penetrate barrier whose focus point can be shifted by the pilot. So, in theory, it can be thickened to the front to protect the charge of a Knight Gallant. It could also be used to temporarily increase a knight's rear or flank defenses, at the very least until it can turn all of its weaponry towards the enemy. Small arms fire is basically pointless against the Ion Shield, and it is even quite capable of stopping anti-tank weaponry as well, making halting the charge of a determined Knight Gallant a significant challenge indeed. And, of course, you have the opposite extreme as well, like the Knight Crusader, which often takes to the field with an Avenger Gatling cannon in one arm and a rapid-fire battle cannon in the other. The Avenger is capable of shredding damn near any infantry, no matter how heavy, and will also turn most lightly armored vehicles to mush within seconds, pummeling them into scrap heaps with repeated, unceasing impacts. And due to the sheer caliber of the weapon, even main battle tanks are far from safe, although the rapid-fire battle cannon would be a better solution to the heavier armor that an enemy might be able to put on the field. And if that wasn't quite enough, they can also carry a missile pod as well. For example, the Iron Storm missile pod or the Storm Spear rocket pod. with the former primarily being used against medium to heavy tank targets, and the latter being used against large and preferably fairly heavy infantry formations, although there are variants on both. As in fact, practically all knightly weaponry will have local variants that are more or less common and well known. The rapid-fire battle cannon, for example, could have a long-barreled design for a higher muzzle velocity, giving it better accuracy against targets over long range and superior armor-penetrating power. Or they could go the complete other direction, with a short-barreled one that fires far larger HE shells at a lower velocity. Or you could simply just slap on yet more barrels. Even the close-quarters weaponry can have some variations. The Thunderstrike Gauntlet can, for example, be fitted with enormous meter-long lightning claws, resembling a super-sized version of those used by Space Marine Terminators. It might seem like hilarious overkill, and it is, but hey, it does look rather awesome, so it's excused. And obviously, carrying around weaponry like this on the field of war is going to make the knights a hefty opponent. But even though a single knight will be, well, the equivalent of, again, like a squadron of battle tanks, the true power of the knights come when they work together, when the knight households deploy entire formations, lancers, and brotherhoods and battle groups of knights, where their different types of weaponry can supplement one another, where the knights' gallants will be able to charge forward underneath the covering hail of fire laid down by a knight crusader. And those crusaders in turn can be protected from any enemy tank hunting teams, be they vehicles or infantry squads getting a little bit too close, by knights errants and paladins. Operating like this, together as a unified whole, a group of veteran knights, many of which will have been fighting alongside one another for years and years, could be the equivalent of a much larger formation. Perhaps even the equivalent of a full Imperial Guard regiment, or at the very least a battalion. It also opens the door for hyper-specialized formations, whose job it is to do one thing, but to do it unbelievably well, and in so doing make their worth greater even than that of a balanced squad, like the Acastus Knight Porphyrion, for example. This is more of an old-school looking knight with the massive hunched-back rear end, and armed with two twin-linked ranged weaponry, in this case twin-linked Magna las cannons, as well as usually a smattering of autocannons and heavy stubbers as well. This is the kind of things that you want to bring to break open the heaviest of entrenched enemy positions, as they can blast apart hull-down tanks, plascrete bunkers, shielded walls, and anything else that gets in their way, frankly. Even void shield defenses mounted on enemy light and medium titans will quickly begin to waver and flash out of existence under a continuous barrage from several of these mighty war machines. Really, it sounds like the knights are the be-all and end-all of warfare in the 41st millennium, and they damn near might be were it not for a couple of drawbacks. One is the fact that along with their knightly traditions also comes a whole reamin heckload of traditions, requirements, rituals, and obeisances that they must make. They can be, to a greater or lesser degree, near completely hide-bound by their very own rules, forbidding them to go too far from their home world, for example, requiring the undergoing of lengthy daily rituals, making sure that they only fight on certain days or alongside certain formations, or that they don't fight at all during certain circumstances. Maybe if it's raining, for example, they can't go out and fight. Or maybe Tuesdays are bath days, and so they must spend the entire 24 hours soaking in a tub. God Emperor alone knows why. Nor do the knights themselves know half the time, but they do know they've got to do it. And even if you can get them off-world and get them integrated with other Imperial forces, well, the Questor Imperialis, the Imperial side of the knightly families, they've got their own ideas on how to do things. They've been fighting in their knights and alongside each other for a very, very long time, and they figured they've got this whole fighting thing more or less sewn up, honestly. And this will be true regardless of whether or not they have the faintest idea about what they're actually doing. Because of course, hunting random monsters through the hinterlands of a forest planet is slightly different from taking part in a major set-piece battle against an organized and mechanized foe with dedicated anti-tank and maybe even anti-titan weaponry. Whilst it's all fine and good to hoist the banners and go charging into the forest, you know, that flag could be a bit of a detriment at the top of your enormous war machine if the enemy's got some shadow swords, for example, dug in over yonder ridge. Again, iron shields are cute and all, but a volcano cannon, well, that shit's designed to tear down titans. And a knight, for all of its bluster, is not quite there. But, at the same time, not every knight is going to be a hot-headed retard either, and honestly, not every battlefield is going to have a shadow sword either, so in many cases, the hot-headed retard might get away with it, at least for a while, until there is a shadow sword on the other side of the hill. But the more long-lived of knightly houses will no doubt have developed a certain respect for the commanders of their companion forces over the years. There might even be those knightly households, as mentioned, that have long-standing relationships with local Imperial forces, be it a particular regiment, or a particular commander, or a particular world, or a particular Astartes legion. Legion chapter. We're not in 30k just yet. Although there were knights in 30k as well. In fact, it was during 30k that most of the knight worlds were originally rediscovered, like House Krast on the world of Crises, which was the very first knight world to be found. But anyways, if you've got a knightly household who has a long-standing commitment to a certain planet and serves alongside regiments from that planet, well, in all due likelihood, the commanders will have, over the years, developed a good working relationship. Perhaps even a tradition of working relationships, so that both parties understand where the other's sensitive spots lies, so that they can avoid stepping on one another's toes. Perhaps a series of protocols could be drawn up, so that the knights feel that they are always being valued and appreciated, and that any tactical suggestions from the Imperial commander are always delivered as just that, tactical suggestions. Not orders, God help me, no, of course not. We would never dare order you to do anything. But it is also in return understood that the knight commander will follow the suggestions, at least to the greater extent of his ability. In this regard, the Questor Mechanicus, the other half of the knightly households, those who work directly with the Adeptus Mechanicus, are a bit better off, because they are integrated directly into the Mechanicus' hierarchy, or more correctly, directly into the Titan Legion's hierarchy. They will be expected to work alongside their legion masters and follow orders like everybody else. They will operate alongside Skitarii forces, and they will be expected to mesh with them effectively. As in this case, the knights are not the stars of the show anymore. They are merely another form of super heavy infantry, deployed to make sure that the Titans, the real kings and queens of the battlefield, get to reign supreme over everything their deadly weapon batteries behold. Sure, you might still have the occasional example of a young hothead, or a knight in need of some recognition, shall we say, who desires to prove himself and perhaps mark himself out for special praise or privileges or honors, or simply just to build a reputation back home, who might, go a little bit rogue here and there. But within the Questor Mechanicus, this kind of behavior is expected to be reined in rather rapidly, as no machine can run flawlessly if one of its cogs is spinning in the wrong direction. And again, we might be making mountains out of molehills here. Unavoidable molehills, probably, considering the temperament of the average knight. But it's not like they're complete solo mavericks either. Often, the knightly worlds will have an extensive system of their own conscription services. Footmen, bannermen, private armies, etc. It's not like the planet will rely exclusively on their knights alone. Rather, the knights might simply be the spear thrust to finish off a wounded beast or a predator, long after the footmen, the bannermen, the servants, the whatever you'd call them, housecarls, etc., have actually located and driven the prey into a position where it can be finished off. Obviously, some plans as well. Again, you can have a knight world, okay, and you've got maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 dozen knights, maybe, over all of the knightly houses. That's going to be a rather thin defensive line if something comes from the outside. You're going to need a standing army. And they're not averse to this, they simply see it as another form of, privatized PDF. And indeed, there have been many night worlds that have been exposed to large-scale invasions by various Xenos threats, orcs, Tyranids, even a few quarrels with the Tau in that part of the galaxy, and chaos as well. Knights are resistant to chaos influence, but certainly very far from immune to it, and will, over time and extended exposure, turn into de facto demon engines, where the pilot, in all due likelihood, will be long dead, but his corrupted soul and spirit will be bound to the machinery, the titan, the knight, or whatever that he once piloted. Or, if he's particularly unlucky, he might even be warped into something that is a direct part of what was once machine. There are entire titans that are, well, practically living demon engines at this point, where its once command crew has fused with the machine, experiencing all of its pain and suffering as if it was their own, whilst chaining up and shutting away the once knowable machine spirit. Much the same could potentially happen to a knight too, which would be the worst fate, perhaps, of all, considering the dishonor it would bring upon the house and the user's very soul. But when an outside visitor does arrive, it is going to be far from a cakewalk to overrun a knight world, as it is likely to have quite a few knightly households with quite a few internal formations. So, knights are usually deployed, unless they are free blades or individualistic in the extreme, as small groups, lancers or courts as they are usually referred to, with the lance usually simply being a collection of knights or regular fighting men, and the court being the personal entourage of a high nobility. As of course, as with any feudal system, there are ranks within the knightly orders, starting with Knight Apparent. This title is awarded to anyone who makes it through their ritual of becoming and successfully bonds themselves with a war machine. A, far from hazardless experience. Now, it's not like becoming a space marine or anything. You've got a healthy 90% success rate in bonding with a knight, but that still, of course, leaves an uncomfortably meaty 10% failure chance. And failing to bond with a war machine like a knight, or any neural interface war machine in general, is going to leave the person in question with a most unenviable state of mind and body, if they even survive the ordeal. The pilot in question will then shed his apparent rank, usually after his first battle, or after some sort of defining event that makes it clear that he is now truly a knight. And for most knights, that is indeed going to be the end of the internal ladder, as the high nobility, well, they are by and large born, though there are a variety of additional honorary titles and appointments within a royal or a noble household, but the truly big title, like High King or Principe for the Questor Mechanicus, or Barons or other grand titles, are reserved for those in the correct lineage. And no doubt there are tons of different noble titles as well throughout the various knight worlds. There might even be those who have quite complex hierarchies, with marquises and dukes and barons and counts and all manners of things. But by and large, these will be hereditary titles. I'm sure there might be some knight worlds as well, where there is a degree of merit involved, like the better son receiving the title or something like that, but by and large, it will be kept within the family. And there certainly is no opportunity for a mere peasant to somehow become a knight, unless he... I don't know, well, first and foremost, he's going to have to get the neural sockets installed, which ain't happening, and then he's going to have to steal his way into the fortress, plug himself into a knight, and then somehow convince the masters of the knightly house that he's tuts one of them or something. Yeah, it ain't gonna happen. As to the knights, their lineage, their traditions, well, these are their honor. It is as much a part of them as their knights or their weapons or their ancient holdfasts. The lineage is them. And so they're not going to let just anybody waltz in and claim it, now are they? As they do take this stuff very, very seriously. As they should, considering their lineage often stretches all the way back to the dawning days of the Imperium, even in some cases beyond that most glorious of beginnings. Now, you've probably got a little bit of a better idea of what Imperial Knights are, and Mechanicus Knights too as a tiny bit of a bonus, though they might need a bit more of an expansive video in the future, as they do have some pretty significant differences from the Imperial Knights. Though, I do also want to end here with a little bit of a side lore rant, if you will excuse me, on a couple of points about the Knights. So, initially, the reason why they had the feudal system was actually because the first rule said, but back in 1990s thing, was actually that they were competing with Eldar Knights for, well, the rights to herd retarded animals and nonsense. And the Imperial Knights created a feudal system where they had specialized personnel, drovers, to actually take care of the flocks themselves, whilst the knights were lazing about and waging war against the Eldar. That was the rationale for the feudal system, whereas in modern 40k it's kind of been forced into the plot, because if we accept that these were supposed to be utilitarian war machines with, war machines capabilities, then okay. But then, in that case, why is every single knight world the same? Why did all the knights turn into war machines? Why do they all seem to be so standardized in pattern? Now again, granted, there are quite a few variations in weaponry and heraldry and some design, but all of these worlds, scattered across the entire galaxy, all had pretty much the exact same idea, and it all resulted in the exact same style of feudal system that seemingly didn't collapse almost anywhere, at least not that we've heard of. That sounds like a very convenient excuse to have knights in 40k and make them big old walking mechanical monsters, doesn't it? Yes, it very much so does. Even the excuse that they were made specifically to deal with large predators only holds up so far, as there are knightly worlds that are, well, by all accounts, apparent peaceful paradises, where one must then assume that somebody found the knightly pattern in the STC database and thought themselves, well, this would give me a decided advantage over everybody else, built one, and then immediately began oppressing the rest of the colonists with it. Which is not an impossible idea, surely, but a fairly dark one. But hey, it's 40k. Perhaps that would, in fact, be rather fitting. Honestly, I would much prefer it if the knights were simply some sort of mini titans, created specifically for Forge Worlds, because the Mechanicus knights make a fair bit of sense. Okay, they're hyper-advanced specialized war machines that require a lot of specialized maintenance, a lot of specialized parts, a lot of specialized training. That sounds like something that the Mechanicus would absolutely engage in. And they do make excellent support machines for Titans, of course. But the Imperial Knights, the Questor Imperialis, I don't like them. As an exception to the rule, maybe. Like a handful of knightly houses, sure. But as an entire army, That is also the effect they've had upon the actual rule set of the game repeatedly, as my god, they are one of those armies that several times throughout 40k's history, where if somebody brings these guys to the table, you just hate the person who did so. Like, they're like the pop-up shooty all battlesuit and marker lights Tau army. The shit you bring specifically to make enemies. Not to mention their price points. Again, the knights are one of those things where I look at them and I think to myself, okay, there has clearly been some thought and some passion put into creating them, at the very least from a design and aesthetic perspective, but at the same time, they're also one of those dividing lines where you see them and you think, was this motivated primarily by an interest to go back in time and recreate some of those old little ideas from Apocalypse and Epic? Or were they primarily motivated by the idea of having another big, stompy, knight-inspired thing, a la, two-legged space marines with mech nonsense, that you could give a nice and hefty price tag of 150-odd bucks, and also make them ridiculously good in the bargain? Personally, I must admit I lean somewhat towards the latter. But, regardless of your perspective on the knights, hopefully you do now have a little bit of a better understanding of the knightly houses and their machines and how they wage war in generalistic terms. We are going to have to revisit Chaos Knights at some point, however, the Free Blaze as well, and the Demon Knights. Now, I don't know if the Demon Knights are even canon anymore, mind you, but they used to be straight-up Demon Knights, dedicated specifically to Slanesh, I think. I do not believe the other gods ever got Demon Knights, but there was a little range of, oh god, like, I remember they looked, well, I don't know, I might be talking out of my ass here, because I'm calling them Demon Knights, but I also remember that they didn't look like knights at all. They essentially were like bipedal fighting machines with like giant guns on their heads and like crab claws and shit. Maybe they were even like scout titans or some stupid shit like that, but they were a thing, and I'll have to look them up before I go any further on that, but that could absolutely be a topic as well. Anywho, enough waffle. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a very good day.